Of my research poster exploring the way in which I'm conducting my literature research. This was presented as the formative assessment task for Module 2 on Saturday 14th of November 2020, and I'm now going to make it available publicly after that session took place. So the eagle-eyed amongst you may notice that a large part of this poster is a tube map which looks remarkably like the Tyne and Wear Metro, and that's because it is. But that isn't just because I happen to like all things northeast, it's because I realised that the Tyne and Wear Metro map actually serves as a very, very good representation of the process that I'm going through, searching for literature and establishing the gap in knowledge which my study can fill. So the green route of the Tyne and Wear Metro map, as adapted by me, goes from the themes that I'm looking at, starting at the airport end, and from the other end in Sunderland starts with the key ideas that I'm looking at. And where these converge at what would be Monument Station, in other words at the junction with the yellow route, this is where I've sorted out from my themes and my key ideas what it is I'm actually going to search for literature on, and it converges there with recommendations for literature, which I'll mention a little bit more in a second, and then goes into the yellow line, which is a continuous loop serving the coast, but then coming back into the city and starting all over again, and that references or illustrates the iterative process that I'm going through in searching for literature. I'll explain that in a second. So the themes I'm looking at are higher education, probably higher education only in the United Kingdom. Vaguely, possibly, I may have to or might consider including higher education in places such as Australia, which have been much influenced by UK higher education. But I think it's going to be UK only. And in particular, I'm going to look at things probably from the 1990s onwards, possibly as far back as the 1980s. And the reason for this is because as I've explored the topic, which is about assessment processes, I've realised that it's not until the early to mid 1980s that you really start to get issues arising in policies, processes, in common use in higher education establishments, around assessment having clearly published criteria against which it will be assessed. And without those criteria, it's not really going to be very easy to examine what I want to look at. So I'll explain my research question at this point, which is represented by the large word out question mark. As you can see from the title of the poster, I started out with my doctoral proposal saying that I wanted to investigate whether or not assessors are facilitating success or marking to fail. In other words, whether they are looking at work with an eye to awarding the maximum possible credit, or looking at it with an eye to spotting all the errors or as many errors as they possibly could, and therefore suppressing credit. Well, I've refined that a little bit in Module 1, as you might expect, and made it into a more sensible, streamlined question, which is simply to say, what do academics actually do when they mark work? In other words, what are the thought processes that they go through in order to arrive at a judgment about the quality of the work they're marking? And I think that's almost certainly going to have to focus on how they use marking criteria, assessment criteria, since from 1988 onwards, and before that in some situations, criteria became commonplace. I picked 1988 because legislation was passed in 1988 in the Formal Education Act, which meant that making sure assessment was fair and transparent, which is two of the ideas on my key ideas part of the Green Line as well, came in, and along with that the idea that established criteria would be published and made available to students before the actual assessment took place, for example at the start of the course or module. Going back to my Green Line and my themes, student satisfaction comes into this because, again, starting from the late 1980s onwards, there's been successive different processes introduced, which mean that universities are required to participate in, or at least if they don't participate in the voluntary ones, then they certainly become less popular, participate in processes to show student outcomes, student satisfaction, and other metrics which are used to establish whether a university is a good university or a less good one, and so on. So that's the theme, starting, as I say, from the top left, the airport end of the network, and coming down to Monument. And if you can see the mouse on the screen, for anyone not familiar with the Tyne and Wear Metro map, we're looking here at the intersection of the two routes. And then, as I say, starting at the Sunderland end of the Green Route, we've got my key ideas, which are to consider some of those things I've just alluded to that have come in recent years: national standards, local policies, marking schemes or criteria, judgments being made, fairness and transparency, the concepts of facilitating success or marking to fail. Arguably, some of these things perhaps ought to be in a different order along the line, but since this is informing searches for literature, I don't think it's too important which order they come in. And again, we reach the central interchange where the two parts of the Green Route meet. Now, I said a moment ago that I'd mentioned the recommendations bit out here at St James's Park, and the recommendations are those that I've received from colleagues that I've worked with in the past or have established links with more recently at a number of different higher education institutions who have a very long established track record of working with matters around assessment. In many cases, they have quite a long list of publications to their name. Some of them are highly respected in the field of assessment and advising on assessment and so on. And many of them have been kind enough to recommend some of the works which they believe are the most important in the field to me. So that sort of gave me a prod in the direction of what things to search for, as did my own themes and my own key ideas. And so, not surprisingly, very, very uninspiringly, I can tell you that I've mainly searched through the Library Gateway service at my HEI, Sheffield Hallam, and also to some extent through external searches, basically internet search engines. And of course, as I've found material, I've been able to reflect on what I've seen. I've also added in some of my own previous experiences, such as an external examiner. I've added in things that have cropped up in the news, in current affairs in recent times. And when I've read material that I've already looked up, there's been the bibliographies and the citations within that. And many of those things have led me back to another search, an enhanced search or a refined search or a completely different search for further literature on the topic, hence using the yellow route as the metaphor for that process, because it goes round on itself in an iterative way. Now, if you happen to know the Tyne and Wear Metro route, you'll know that this little blue line here is not actually a metro line. It's the Shields Ferry between North and South Shields. And I'm using that as a metaphor for, or to represent, the gap in knowledge or the niche into which my research will go. Because as things stand, unless you're going to use the ferry, then you have to go back to the interchange and change to a different line in order to go out on the green line there. So I'm looking for a bridge, something to fill the gap, and that's where my niche fits into this, my niche of trying to understand what it is that academics do when they mark work. How do they actually reach those judgments? What are the thought processes going on? And so I've rather cornerly represented the niche with a series of different architectural niches. Not quite sure at this stage exactly what shape my niche is. I think I've got it down to a reasonably clearly defined shape, but still trying to exactly refine that, and that will come with what information I am able to find in existing literature. But at the moment, it seems that the gap in knowledge is fairly clearly that main research question I have. What is actually going on in the academic's mind? What is the thinking process, i.e. what do they do when they mark work? And in terms of how I intend to investigate this, once I've completed the literature review and moved on to a later stage of my Ed.D, I am at this stage thinking that the most appropriate way to research this will be using thinking aloud protocols, hence representing this with various thoughts coming from the person's brain and the megaphone to broadcast or to articulate in verbal form those thoughts. So at this stage it's looking as though I can probably look forward to gathering data by asking assessors to talk through the thought process they're going through as they mark pieces of work and hopefully gather data from that. And the main reason I've chosen thinking aloud processes or protocols is because, well, there's lots of reasons really, but first of all and most important in my mind, I don't want to actually alter what the assessors are doing. I don't want to do anything which could influence or in any way change the judgments that they're making, because I want to get a fair representation of the judgments that they make without being influenced by any other external factors. Otherwise, in the first place, assuming that the marking they're doing is already to an accurate and good standard, I could influence them so that they become less accurate in their marking. And also because for my research, if I do influence, or if anything else influences what they're doing, then it won't really tell me what I need to know. It'll tell me something different about a unique situation where they're being observed or whatever, rather than an ordinary situation. And we read in literature such as Brooks, for example, that it's really important when we're looking at judgment, which is in itself a tacit process, that the research method should leave no trace of its working, should not in any way influence, affect, or leave behind any sign that it's ever been involved with the process it's watching. There's also literature that suggests that thinking aloud protocols substantially increase the amount of data that you can get. Payne, for example, has written about that at some length. And we know that where we use thinking aloud protocols carefully and appropriately, we can elicit the sort of accurate record of the behaviour of the subject. And that's the most important thing that I want, that accurate record of the uninfluenced, unaltered behaviour. And the level of detail, of course, can only be beneficial. The more you get, the better it is. So that's where I currently am with my literature search, and I rather fancy that this attempt to vlog it as a monologue is probably less clear and more hesitant than the presentation was to the session today, where people were asking questions and I was responding to them rather than just trying to explain it all in one go.